The Flash is a movie over 10 years in the making with one of the most controversial leads of all time. Not to mention, the movie was originally supposed to release in 2018 until it was eventually delayed 6 times and finally releasing in 2023. To be honest, it's a miracle this movie even exists, let alone is actually finally releasing. Despite all of this production trouble, about 2 years ago we started hearing that it was one of the greatest superhero movies of all time. It began test screening and every test screening was apparently incredible. And that alone was enough to build up hype for this movie despite all of its troubles. James Gunn would eventually go on to add flame to the fire, calling it one of the best superhero movies he's ever seen when he took over at DC Studios. Is he a little biased there? Absolutely, but James Gunn has created some of the best comic book movies of all time, so people definitely take his word. This past March, Tom Cruise, the savior of cinema itself, called Andy Muschietti himself to praise the movie. Reportedly, he asked David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Brothers, for a copy himself because he wanted to see it so bad. The Hollywood Reporter reported that in the phone call, Cruise told Muschietti it is everything you want in a movie and exactly the movie we need right now. From there, everyone from Terry Crews to Stephen King himself came out of nowhere seemingly supporting and praising this movie. Stephen King specifically said he doesn't normally care for superhero movies as a rule, but he loved this movie and found it full of heart and charm. This seemed to be Warner Brothers' marketing strategy for the movie because, as previously mentioned, the lead of this movie is controversial to say the least. In addition to the countless celebrities praising the movie, they held a ton of fan screenings all over the world so people could see the movie early and talk about it. All of this built up this movie's hype to insane levels, and here we are today to answer the ultimate question. Does The Flash live up to the hype? Before we get into that, it is important to mention that in my opinion this movie is great. I am a huge fan of the Flash as a character, so my biggest concern with this movie was the first ever Flash movie wasn't going to be a Flash movie and instead was going to be Michael Keaton's Batman Returns. And I am so relieved to say that is absolutely not the case. This movie is a Barry Allen movie through and through, and I think its best moments are when it focuses on the character of Barry Allen, well, both Barry Allens and the Flash as a whole. The two Barry Allens have the most screen time by far, and Michael Keaton and Sasha Calle are in it a lot less than you're expecting. Funnily enough, that's actually one of the criticisms I have of the movie. I think Supergirl was utilized very well, but I would have loved to see more of her. Anyway, we'll get back to Batman and Supergirl when we talk about their roles in spoilers later. Let's get back to it. Back to the Barrys, Ezra Miller is absolutely fantastic as both Barry Allens. I've never particularly loved Ezra Miller's portrayal of Barry Allen. I've always preferred Grant Gustin's and a more comic booky feel. Ezra was just always a little weird to me in the Justice League movies as Barry, but I gotta say their version of Barry really grew on me throughout this movie. Having the younger, college-aged Barry Allen around was a really great choice, and it's a really good contrast to this more experienced version of Barry we see now. Hell, present-day Barry even talks about how annoying this younger version of himself is and how nobody would ever like him. The opening of this movie is absolutely incredible, and it really makes me wish the whole movie had the same tone and kind of groundedness that the opening does. We see Barry as a forensic scientist struggling to balance his duty to the Justice League, his duty to his department, and his duty to his father, who is still wrongfully imprisoned for the murder of his mother. We even see Flash characters throughout this opening bit, like Albert Desmond, who's played by that guy from Vine, Patty Spivot, and of course Kiersey Clemons' return as Iris West. This is what I want from a Flash movie, let alone the first Flash movie ever. But that is just not what this movie is, and I've come to accept that. This version of Barry has been active for years within the DCU, and I really wish we got some exposition or just something to tell us what he's been doing throughout that time. We know he took down Captain Boomerang like way back when. We know he teamed up with the Justice League in Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is actually canon, which I'm super happy about. Not that it matters, everything's getting reset anyway, but I'm still glad to see it mentioned. But I would have loved to see or at least hear what he's been doing since his origin, like 7 years ago at this point. We know he's constantly working for the Justice League. He feels like the janitor of the League, not a full-fledged member, but I would have loved a line from Batfleck maybe saying something like, "Oh, great job taking down the Mirror Master," or "Are those rogues giving you trouble?" Just something to let us know this universe continues when we're not watching it. Hell, if it was up to me, I would have had the opening sequence of the movie be him and maybe Batman teaming up to fight the rogues instead of these random unnamed criminals we see in Gotham City, but whatever, that is not the point. The opening of this movie really felt like an episode of Justice League Unlimited. We see Bruce and Barry working together, maybe some other people I'm not going to mention. We see them working together with Alfred in their ear to take down criminals, and it finally feels like this universe is connected. I mean, it's definitely too late, it's being reset like now, but it's great to finally see the DCU being interconnected and explored as it should have been from the start. Again, it would have been cool to see them defeating iconic Flash villains or just like any named villain instead of these random bank robbers, but whatever, I get it. As previously mentioned, Ben Affleck does reprise his role as Batman for seemingly the last time within this movie, and he is great in it. He said himself in an interview he finally feels like he got the Batman thing down on his last rodeo, and I think he's 100% right. He killed it despite having the worst Batsuit of all time. Considering this is almost definitely his last ever time as Batman, I do wish the movie gave him a better send-off, but we'll get to that later. Again, I wouldn't have complained if we got more screen time for him, but considering the mess the DCEU has had on his life, I'm just glad we got him at all. Eventually, after talking with Bruce and Iris West separately, Barry gets the idea to go back in time and save his mother. Now, this is where the movie really kicks off and we lose the grounded feel of the beginning. You know, how grounded can you be with a guy that runs around at light speed alongside a guy that's dressed as a bat, but you get it. Barry goes to an alternate timeline where his mother is still alive, and he meets a younger, douchier version of himself, basically your stereotypical college frat guy. This younger version of Barry is absolutely hysterical throughout this movie, and a lot of the comedy of the movie comes from him. Him and Barry get up to some fun hijinks with their powers until eventually going to find Bruce Wayne to help stop Zod. You're never going to believe this part, but when they go to find Ben Affleck's Batman, they're instead greeted by an older, more experienced Batman in the form of Michael Keaton. The three of them get up to some hijinks in the Batcave before eventually deciding they have to go find Superman, who they believe landed in Russia. You're never going to believe this part, but instead of finding Superman, they find Kara Zor-El, Supergirl. Now, this movie more or less recreates Man of Steel's kind of final battle with Zod, and I am a huge fan of Man of Steel, and I was worried they were going to kind of ruin it, but I don't think they did. I have one issue with it we'll get to in spoilers, but it works. Based on any of the trailers or posters you've seen, you would expect Kara and Bruce to be in this movie as much as the two Barrys, but like I said before, that is absolutely not the case. I think Michael Keaton's Batman had a pretty perfect amount of screen time. You get to see a lot of him without him overshadowing the main character, whereas I think Kara deserved more screen time. It was a lot of fun to see Michael Keaton back in the role, especially with modern day technology and CGI that lets him basically become Arkham Batman as he does flips and beats the shit out of people in some great fight scenes. I know there's a lot of dialogue going on about how Michael Keaton's phoning in this performance from the trailers and stuff, but I really don't think that's the case. I think he actually delivers a pretty solid performance here. As I've hinted at a lot, Supergirl kind of stole the show for me here. I think Sasha Calle was absolutely fantastic. We don't get a lot of her, but what we do see is great, and I really hope James Gunn does let her be the Supergirl in Woman of Tomorrow. To be honest, I think part of me was just happy to have a Kryptonian back on the big screen donning the red and blue for the first time in forever. Henry Cavill was in Black Adam, I know, but does that really count? After watching the movie, I can understand why Warner Bros. Dumped all of the marketing responsibility on Sasha Calle's back. She was great. Alright, I'm going to get into spoilers now. If you haven't seen the movie yet, leave and come back later. Something I really liked about the Man of Steel connection is we actually find out Barry Allen was in the Battle of Metropolis. It was his first time becoming a superhero, and he was able to save a little kid's life before running away. I thought this was a really great connection to Man of Steel, and it gives us something about this version of Barry, which is all I really wanted. We finally know what his first act as a hero was. Now, the third act did fall apart for me a little bit. I loved everything up to that point. I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. We basically just get cameos galore in one moment. But before we get to that, I want to talk about my personal biggest problem with this movie. And no, it is not the cameos. The biggest problem I personally have with this movie is the conclusion of Michael Keaton's Batman and Supergirl. Basically, Kara and Bruce keep dying, younger version of Barry keeps rewinding time in an effort to save them, and our Barry realizes that this is a doomed world. There's nothing they can do. No matter what they do, Zod wins. The world engine goes off, this world is completely destroyed. No matter what, that is fate, that is destiny, they are screwed. And I don't think this is necessarily the worst idea if they went with the original ending of the movie. Based on set photos from forever ago, we know in the courthouse in the very end of the movie, Supergirl and Michael Keaton's Batman were supposed to be there. And for better or for worse, at one point in time, the plan for the DCEU was to have Michael Keaton as the main Batman and no Superman and just Supergirl. I don't think that's the best idea in the world, but I do think it's a better emotional conclusion for this movie. The way the movie wraps up on these two characters that we've come to love throughout the movie is just really unsatisfying to me personally. And the thing is, we already know this universe isn't going anywhere. I would understand it if Barry runs into the DCU at the end and we meet the new Batman, but we meet George Clooney and it's obviously not the case. If the ending was already not going to set anything up, why not put those two characters in it so we get some emotional conclusion for those roles? This could be a personal thing. I don't know if anyone else has this issue. I just find that a really unsatisfying ending to these characters. I think one of the biggest problems this movie is going to have is releasing only 2 weeks after Across the Spider-Verse, which tackles a lot of these themes in a much better way. For example, a big part of that movie is Miles standing up to canon events and fate and doing his own thing in the world. And I think that's a great story, and I don't like the idea of our hero Barry Allen just accepting that this world is over, doomed, nothing they could do, done. The idea of the hero of this movie just accepting that his new friends, his past self, his parents, everyone in this world is doomed to die and there's absolutely nothing they can do, it just doesn't work for me personally. Miles Morales, Spider-Man, does whatever he can to save as many people as he can. He literally says he's going to do his own thing, and I just think that would be more satisfying within this movie as well. As the emotional climax of this film happens with younger Barry trying to save his world as older Barry accepts that this is just how it has to be and he's bracing himself to lose his mother, we get given cameo after cameo. Look, I've got nothing wrong with a cameo. If utilized correctly, they can be incredible, but this movie is what people say MCU cameos are, where they just disrupt the entire movie just to throw people in your face. They have no effect on what's going on in the story at all, and they aren't even really explained within the movie. Look, that is by no means the worst thing in the world. Some fun little cameos popping up here and there to show off DC's rich cinematic history is not necessarily the bad thing, but the way they were handled within this movie is. I'm gonna read off all the Speed Force cameos within this movie. We have George Reeves, Christopher Reeve, Teddy Sears as Jay Garrick, supposedly Helen Slater, Adam West, and Nicolas Cage Superman. In theory, these cameos can be really fun and a super great addition to an already solid movie. Are they? Absolutely not. You may have noticed 3 of the people I just named are in fact no longer with us. Oh, did they just use like archival footage to make them cameo? That's actually really great. Nope, they didn't do that at all. They make these beloved characters and actors into these weird, uncanny valley CGI puppets, and it just doesn't work. They don't even just do that for the dead actors, they do that for the alive ones too. I don't understand why they wouldn't just get Nick Cage, put him in front of a green screen, and then place him into this giant spider fight he's in when we see him in the movie. I genuinely don't even know if Nick Cage knows he's in this movie. It's a weird CGI version of him. Surely it would have been easier to just get him for a scene. Early in the movie, it is set up that the Speed Force has this weird uncanny valley CGI thing going on, and credit where credit's due, I do think this is an artistic choice. The movie didn't set out to have the worst CGI ever in these moments, but that's the art style they went with, and I'm not saying that excuses it at all, but I do think it's important to remember. I think there's potential here. I think there's so much potential here, and that's why it hurts so much. You can absolutely use archived footage of Christopher Reeve, who is so many people's Superman. He's the most iconic Superman. Throw in a scene of him just flying or something. That would have been beautiful. I think using these dead actors is going to be a lot of people's biggest problem with this movie, and I don't think, more power to you, I completely get that. It's just wrong. Before we get off the topic of cameos, I have to ask why these specifically. Andy Muschietti said he had full control over whoever he wanted in this movie, and he chose these specific cameos in this way. Grant Gustin is such an obvious choice here. He played The Flash for over a decade. He's most people's first thought when they hear the word The Flash. Not to mention, he already met Ezra Miller's Flash. He's the only reason Ezra Miller's Flash even goes by the name The Flash. Grant Gustin's character gave him that name. If you asked me before the movie came out, I would have genuinely put $1,000 on the fact that Grant Gustin would be in this movie. I was so confident, and I don't want this to sound like I'm just bummed out I didn't see one of my favorite characters. It's not just that. It's just why a CGI puppet of Christopher Reeve instead of the most iconic Flash we've ever gotten. Speaking of iconic Flashes, where was John Wesley Shipp? The first ever on-screen version of this character, who will go on to reprise his role as Barry Allen within Crisis on Infinite Earths, and also be Jay Garrick throughout the Flash show, and Henry Allen. Not to mention, he even voiced the Reverse Flash. This man has given so much to the Flash franchise as a whole, and using Teddy Sears as Jay Garrick instead of him is a mind-boggling decision that I just do not understand. I've mentioned it a couple times now. Let's get into the Teddy Sears thing. Throughout this cameo montage, we see Jay Garrick running in like old-timey, it's black and white, and it hasn't been confirmed, but this looks identical to Teddy Sears. I've seen a lot of people say the same thing. When I saw the character, my first thought was, oh my god, is that Teddy Sears? For anyone who doesn't know, Teddy Sears played the character Zoom on the 2nd season of the Flash TV show. To be fair, he did also play Jay Garrick, but he was Zoom undercover as Jay Garrick, so I don't understand why you would use him in this movie. It is mind-boggling to me. To be fair, there's a chance he's just a random CGI'd man. I mean, who knows? But it really looked like Teddy Sears. And I genuinely think the people responsible for this looked up Jay Garrick on Google Images, saw Teddy Sears as Jay Garrick, didn't understand any of the context, and just threw him in here. Putting Teddy Sears instead of Grant Gustin or John Wesley Shipp is just genuinely the most insane choice I've ever seen in my life, and is just disrespectful to those two actors. I'm sorry, it is. I know Andy Muschietti came out a while ago and said Grant Gustin is not going to be in the movie. They couldn't get a time to film the scene or something. That's bullshit. I'm sorry, that's bullshit. Hell, you don't even need him there to film the scene. I doubt anyone in this cameo montage was even there. They're weird CGI monstrosities. They're not the actors. Titans, the TV show Titans that has been ridiculed since the moment it started and we heard Robin say fuck Batman, it did a better multiversal cameo thing than this movie with a $200 million budget and 10 years of development. Also, Nicolas Cage Superman in this cameo montage is really cool to see. It's a very niche reference that I'm not sure everyone there is going to get, but it is really cool to see and got a big clap from my audience. But I can't think of how much cooler it would have been to actually see Nicolas Cage as Superman and not this weird Uncanny Valley puppet version of him. You know what I mean? I genuinely wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years Nick Cage is doing an interview and he mentions that he didn't even know he was going to be in the movie. One last cameo to mention: at the very end of the movie, we get George Clooney's Batman. And look, I think this is fun. It gets a really hilarious reaction from Barry, who says, like, who the fuck are you? Because he's exhausted from finding so many different Bruce Waynes. And I think this is fun. I don't really have a problem with this. I don't mean to sound like a hater. Genuinely, I loved this movie. The cameo thing is just so weird to me. But yeah, George Clooney pops up for a second. It's fun. It's a wholesome little scene. I got no problem with it. But again, if we're reshaping the DCU at the very end and Batfleck isn't Batfleck anymore, why not just throw Supergirl and Batman in there? It doesn't hurt. Or at least make it Michael Keaton's Batman. Whatever. I'm over it. Barry realizes he can't make a change as drastic as saving his mother, and in a really emotional scene says his final goodbyes to her. This might be my favorite scene in the movie, and I am man enough to admit I cried during it. The movie ends with Barry being able to exonerate his father of the crime, so at least he gets one parent, because his change wasn't that drastic. He just, like, moved tomato cans. That probably sounds insane if you haven't seen the movie. If you've seen it, you know what I mean. And this is another really beautiful scene between Barry and his father. I cried here too. Again, man enough to admit it, I cried twice in this movie. And then Barry goes outside the courthouse, meets George Clooney's Batman, and the movie just ends there. And I think this ending is just so weird and not really satisfying. Again, my problem is not with George Clooney's cameo. I think that's fun. It just isn't an emotionally satisfying conclusion to this movie. I think it would have been really great if Barry was able to somehow work through time and save these two people that helped him so much. I think this scene was really missing Michael Keaton and Sasha Calle. I think it would have been great if Barry learned he can't save everybody, but he can save some people at least, and fight back against this idea of a doomed world and doomed people. I just don't understand why they would change the ending of this movie. If we already know this version of the DCEU isn't going anywhere, you might as well give us an emotionally satisfying conclusion with these two characters. But whatever, I've talked about it enough. An optimal ending would have been the original Justice League characters alongside these two new characters as the camera pans away and we see them all, or something like that, to give us a satisfying conclusion to the DCEU. Because as the big universe ender, it's just not really satisfying, and it doesn't pay homage to the 10 years of the DCU as much as I would have liked. Hell, the cameo scene could have just been all the Justice Leaguers from this universe. I think that would have been much more satisfying, but whatever, I've ranted about that enough. Now here comes the ultimate question we have sought out to answer. Does this movie live up to the hype? The answer is simple. No, and it never would have. It is a fantastic movie in its own right, but Warner Brothers marketing it as the best comic book movie you will ever see might have screwed it over. Audiences have heard for years now that this is the best thing ever, but it's not, and it was never going to be. Warner Brothers shot themselves in the foot by marketing it as such. This movie sets out to do exactly what Across the Spider-Verse did phenomenally. A story about someone finding their own place within the multiverse, fighting back against fate and destiny, and along the way showing some fun multiversal cameos to honor that franchise. Across the Spider-Verse does this beautifully, and The Flash kind of fumbles along. The second worst thing to happen to this movie, besides Warner Brothers hyping it up so much, is the fact it releases only 2 weeks after Across the Spider-Verse. I cannot emphasize how much that's going to hurt it. That movie does everything The Flash does a million times better. We see Andrew Garfield and we see Tobey Maguire, but it doesn't take away from the core of that movie. It doesn't take away from the emotional aspects, and most importantly, they're not dead puppets. I know it really must sound like I hate this movie, but I don't. I love it. I love it a lot. I am a huge fan of The Flash and have been for almost a decade at this point, and again, I really loved this version of him on the big screen. This movie could have been so much more, and it should have been so much more, and it just wasn't. The reason it sounds like I hate this movie so much is because there is a phenomenal Flash movie buried beneath some of the ugliness. We didn't need this multiversal extravaganza, we just needed a story about the Flash as a character, and we see that at so many points, and that is by far the best parts of the movie. Could the movie have been better? Absolutely. Should they have CGI dead actors? Absolutely not. Ultimately, does this movie live up to the years of hype? Unfortunately, it doesn't, but it never was going to, and by itself, it is a fantastic movie.